This is Dr. Tom Bittker, author of Dragon Slaying. Those of you who don't know about the book might find it useful if you are overcoming loss or trauma. It's a fast track to health. I am delighted, honored today to be joined by Charles Dennis. Charles is a renowned author and actor. Uh, he's been an actor since the tender age of 7, has played in a number of roles, has won a number of awards, and has written several books. Charles joins me today from his home in his ranch in California. And Charles, welcome.
Thank you. Does 14 qualify as several or more than several?
14 what?
14 novels.
That's extraordinary.
And one nonfiction book, and about 5 plays, and I've directed 4 or 5 feature-length films, various shorts. Plays have been produced in London, New York, and Los Angeles.
So you're a rather extraordinary guy who, despite your tender years, has achieved a great deal. Let me begin by asking you, for the sake of our audience, a lot of us, in fact, as I shared with you prior to our introduction, a lot of us are frustrated actors. I ultimately, as my biography may or may not reflect, I became a medical student because I didn't see the prospect of earning a living as an actor to be as predictable as my capacity on multiple choice exams promised me. How did you fall into acting?
I was spared, just to go back to your thing. I had 2 older brothers. One became a doctor, the other became a lawyer, so I didn't have anything like that. When my daughter was diagnosed with ADHD, I called my eldest brother and said, Ethne has ADHD. And he said, well, you did. I said, what? He said, we didn't know what to call it then. It was Spilkes, And, my mother didn't know what to do with me. I was apparently just bouncing off the walls. And this was at the height of Martin and Lewis. And I thought I was I was channeling Jerry Lewis and just doing all this wild stuff. And somebody, and to this, unfortunately, my mother's gone to heaven, so I have no idea who recommended Marjorie Purvey to her. But Marjorie Purvey ran a school in Toronto that catered to children in the city, and it was called the Toronto School of Radio Drama. And the best of these students would appear on Miss Purvey's Sunday morning radio show called Peter and the Dwarf. And on my 8th birthday, I was chosen to make my radio debut. So that was the beginning of it. The other thing I recall was when we had Saturday morning classes, and I would get there and wait in the waiting room. She had piles of a magazine called Theater Arts that no longer exists, but it was the most wonderful magazine about the theater. Yeah, so I would sit there, I would sometimes get there half an hour early before the class started and just browse through these theater arts magazines. And every month there was a full-length play in there. So just the theater became, I was inundated with theater, even though radio was what I did between the ages of 8 and 12. And then my school started doing musicals for the first time. And the first musical they did was Peter Pan, and I played Captain Hook. The next year they did Tom Sawyer, and I was Tom Sawyer. And then Wizard of Oz, I was the Cowardly Lion. So I had experience on stage. And then when I was 16, I auditioned for this wonderful theater called the Red Barn Theater in Jackson's Point, Ontario. It was a famous summer stock theater, and got in there and actually played some leads. I mean, I played Dr. Einstein in Arsenic and Old Lace, and I played Simon Bliss in Hay Fever, and that was the beginning of my career.
So, speaking of Arsenic and Old Lace, which I'd say would arguably be among the top 20 high school plays of my generation, Uh, and it has been immortalized, of course, by Cary Grant's film version of it, which never ceases to delight me. You apparently wrote a book about arsenic and old lace entitled,
There it is. I don't know why it's backwards. Why is it backwards on the screen?
no, it's perfect. There is a
Oh,
body in the window seat. Yes.
yeah. The history of arsenic and old lace. This is part of my odyssey. When I was in eighth grade, there used to be a show on Saturday nights on the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation called Great Movies, and this movie came on. I'd never heard of it, and I was mesmerized by this thing. I howled with laughter. I said, this is a movie about murder, a comedy about murder." And I remembered that it said in the opening credits, based on the play by. So on Monday, the following Monday, I went straight to the library after school and found a copy of this play and said, "Oh my God, how incredible." And not only that,
Who wrote the play?
this is this is part of my book that's fascinating, which is this book is not a whodunit, but a who wrote it.
Uh huh.
Credit is given to a man called Joseph Kesselring, but the producers, Howard Lindsay and Russell Crouse, were hugely successful writers on Broadway. And they made a deal with Kesselring after he had done 2 rewrites for them that weren't very good. Um, they would let him keep his name on it. They would split the royalties 50-50, but they would rewrite it. So it really is a great Lindsay Crouse play. And while researching this, I was able to read the original play called Body in the Cellar, I think it was called. And there's the basis of this, but Kesselring was of Germanic descent, and it's really like very heavy Teutonic humor.
Uh-huh.
And the character that we now know as Teddy, the Teddy Roosevelt character, was a stunted baby who was now middle aged, who had a diaper and lived in the wall, and it was like, huh? And then the John Mortimer was this overweight. I think he was a theater critic. I can't remember. And Jonathan was this erudite character with a Van Dyke beard who happened to be a serial killer. Dr. Einstein did nothing but those "Was you there, Charlie" kind of,
Uh-huh.
music hall. It was not very good, but that was the structure was sort of there. But they came in and they streamlined it. And what was interesting, in one of his rewrites, um, they said something about Bela Lugosi, that he looked like Bela Lugosi. Anyhow, they came up with the notion of Karloff. And when I read the play and saw the original cast, Jonathan was played by Boris Karloff on stage. And that was the reason he took it, is when Russell Crouse pitched it to him in Hollywood. He said, "Oh, I don't want to do that." He said, "Yes, but no, listen. He says he killed some guy because he said he looked like Boris Karloff." Well, he said, "I'm in." And he need never have worked again after that play, because he had, not only did he have a huge salary, like $10,000 a week, which is like over 100,000 today, but he had a piece of the show.
That is fascinating. I am. I was a film student, as I shared with you at one time, and in terms of the film production of it, I am amazed at the level of comedic timing in it. It just continues, and it's just, it escalates in terms of its humor. And the passage that, if we can bring this forward a bit, the part of Mortimer was, of course, played by Cary Grant, and the setup is Cary Grant and his fiance are about.
His wife, he's married her. He marries her.
Yeah, he was about to marry her, right? And they they drop Cary Grant off at his aunt's home, uh, and there's a cab driver waiting outside. And periodically, the cab driver attempts to remind Mortimer of the fact that he's waiting outside. And then there's one passage in the film where the cab driver braces Cary Grant, confronts him, and he's grabbing onto his own coat jacket as he's confronting Cary Grant and screams at Cary Grant the anticipated bill, which is accumulated now to $37.50. And Cary Grant touches the fabric of the guy's jacket and says, "Not bad for $37.50," and then proceeds.
Well, that's the Epstein twins. I mean, they were the in-house geniuses at Warner Brothers, and whenever a play was adapted for the screen, the Epstein twins would do it, and they're opening up Arsenic and Lace without losing the quintessential aspect is brilliant. And sometimes they would come up with new lines. With one of my favorites of theirs was when Teddy Brewster had to sign his commitment papers to go to Happydale Sanitarium, and instead of writing Teddy Brewster, he writes Teddy Roosevelt. And they said, we can't have this. And Cary Grant goes, no, you have to do Brewster. It's code. He says, code? He said, yes. What does a rooster do? Crows? And where did you go hunting in Africa? On the veldt. Crow's veldt. Very good. My compliments to the boys in the code department. But, and also the timing, they were very lucky. They borrowed Josephine Hull, Gina Dare, and John Alexander, who had created the roles of the two aunts and Teddy on Broadway. And they were brought out. They had a strict that they had to be finished in 3 weeks to get them back to New York. Karloff assumed he'd go too, and Lindsay and Krauss said, "You can't. If you're not in this play, it will close." And it broke his heart. He never really forgave them. He never said it, but he resented the fact. And then Raymond Massey was made up to look like Karloff. He did a good job, but then they had to get a release from Karloff permitting Raymond Massey to look like him. The book is loaded with all this stuff. It's a fascinating study.
Well, I was impressed, and as you see the film, if you recall, all these bogey films had as an anchor in it in terms of the villainous role Sidney Greenstreet, of course, who didn't play in Arsenic and Old Lace. But of course, Peter Lorre was in there as Karloff's assistant.
Dr. Einstein.
Yes. And the interplay between Peter and Raymond Massey was, of course, incredible. But I thought the timing was beautiful, and your expertise in terms of your book must be quite delightful for Arsenic and Old Lace fans. How many copies have you sold?
I don't know. I haven't had a statement from Applause Books, so I'm waiting because it's over a year now.
You're waiting on the royalties.
Well, the problem is they gave me a decent advance, so who knows? Maybe it hasn't earned back the advance yet. I don't know. But the other fascinating thing in those days, Chicago, the second city, always had their own version of a Broadway show that was running. And who did you get? I mean, Karloff was the boogeyman. He was the monster. Who do you get to do Jonathan in the Chicago company? And whoever came up with the idea, they got Erich von Stroheim.
Oh my God.
Yeah, and then when Karloff went on tour, von Stroheim came to Broadway. My favorite thing about von Stroheim doing it, he was very nervous because it turned out he'd never been on stage in his life. He was strictly a movie guy. And
well, they would trot him out during World War II as kind of like the resident Nazi, right?
Oh, later on, I mean, he'd had this huge career in silence and was, a genius. His directing, except he was, never made any money back on his movies. But the first night out at the first act intermission in Chicago, he said, "I'm quitting. That's it. They hate me. They're hissing at me. I said, who's hissing? The audience. They're hissing at me. And we finally found out it was a radiator backstage that was hissing. When they showed him that the audience loved him, he went on with it. And he ended up doing it for almost 2 years. Karloff just kept doing it forever.
So, did you ever play any other role in Arsenic and Old Lace other than Dr. Einstein?
Well, when I saw that movie the first time when I was 13 and discovered there was a play, and it was my last year of elementary school, I persuaded the principal to let me do a tab 30-minute version of the play. So I played Mortimer.
Uh-huh.
That's the only time I got to play Mortimer. The next year when I went to high school, and I was told nobody in first year high school ever gets to be in the school play. And I said, well, what is it? And they said, it's Arsenic and Old Lace. I said, I'll be in it. And because I was, a kid and hadn't grown to my full height, etc., I got the role of Dr. Einstein. And then 2 years later, when I applied for that summer stock company and found out they were doing Arsenic and Old Lace, I thought, I'm going to get that part again. And I did.
That's wonderful.
And then I directed. A production the following summer. I was the theater instructor at a summer camp, and I directed another version of Arsenic and Old Lace. And Tony Perkins and I were best friends the last 7 years of his life. And our great bond was Arsenic and Old Lace. And I was always envious of the fact he grew up in Boston after his dad died. And he wanted to see Arsenic and Old Lace, and his mother's thing for stopping Tony was always, you won't like it. He went to his grave never having tasted Coca-Cola because Jane Perkins said to him, you won't like it. But he defied his mother, and he went to a matinee, and Karloff was on tour with it. And when it was over, somehow Tony got on stage. He got backstage and walked the set. And that's what convinced him to become an actor. And that was our great bond, was we were both arsenic aficionados.
I'm sorry, Tony whom? Forgive me.
Perkins. Anthony Perkins.
Oh, Tony Perkins. You knew Tony Perkins.
Yes.
Wow. Okay.
As a matter of fact, my new book, Balm of Angels, is dedicated to him.
Well, I would say he probably has a prototypical psychotic villain place for himself in Hollywood immortality for Psycho.
Yeah, which is unfortunate because with so many actors who came from the theater and established a certain persona on screen, they never are allowed to get past it. But Tony was an amazing, amazing actor. The first time I saw him on stage was in The Sunshine. What the hell was it called? It was a Neil Simon thing. It wasn't The Star Spangled Girl.
Uh-huh.
With Tony and Richard Benjamin, and he was hilarious. He was, personally, was one of the funniest people I ever knew.
Did he play opposite Natalie Wood in Splendor in the Grass? Wasn't he the?
No, that was Warren Beatty.
Oh, I'm sorry, he didn't. Okay.
He played opposite Jane Fonda in Tall Story, which had been a Broadway play.
Oh yes. Okay. All right.
And I mean, he, The Matchmaker, which is what Hello Dolly is based on. He and Bobby Morse were the two young men, and Shirley MacLaine, and he's very funny in that, Tony's. And when the two guys go in drag, and it's very, very funny, very underappreciated film.
Getting back to you and your training, it seems like growing up in Toronto, near Stratford, Ontario, which was the epicenter of Canadian Shakespearean work. Did you ever play Shakespeare plays, and were you trained as a Shakespearean actor?
I wasn't. There was something that started in the 1960s called the National Theatre School in Montreal, and a lot of it became you went from the theatre school to Stratford. But I'd already been on stage professionally before a lot of these people at the theater school, before the first graduating year of the theater school. So, and then I worked at Stratford, and I was hired by them because I was already working for the newspaper. There was a little jump in between. When I was 17, I started writing for the Toronto Telegram, doing film and theater reviews. And, it was a balancing act.
So at what point, which is always the thing that struck me about careers in performing arts, at what point did you say, hey, Charles, I can do this. I got this.
I don't think I ever thought about doing anything else after the age of 8.
So there was no choice. This was central to your identity then.
I remember somewhere in my 30s lamenting on the phone to my mother. I said, what kind of it was a low point in my career. So what kind of a profession have I chosen? And she said, it chose you. And it's true. It's like, there was never any thought of something else. My father was desperate for me to get out of that world. He didn't see any future for me in it. He never went to see me in any. He didn't want to encourage me. He did go to see me at the Red Barn because he wanted to see if I could hold my own with these professional actors. And when I did, he sort of shrugged and thought, okay, I was good. So that was a problem but he still kept trying to. There was one point in my early 20s when he tried to persuade me to become a rabbi. Because he said, you have a beautiful voice. You get a house, you get a car. I said, Dad, stop it. A few years after that, I thought, what would have happened?
Are you Jewish?
No kidding.
I didn't know that. Okay.
Oh, okay.
So we are both members of the tribe. I didn't.
Yes, indeed. So a few years after that, I stopped and I thought, what would have happened if I did become a rabbi? And then I realized, well, I would act the part of a rabbi. I would be a fraudulent rabbi. And I ended up writing a book called A Divine Case of Murder about a rabbi who murders his wife.
That sounds wonderful. What happened to the book?
It was only published in Canada, but now this new arrangement that my wife started a publishing company called Vingsbo Press, and we are now affiliated with Amazon Book Publishers, which you know something about. And they're bringing out all of my old books over the next 2 years. So next year, Divine Case of Murder will finally have, an outlet in America. George Barry, who was the head of Fabergé and was a movie producer for a while in the 70s or into the 80s, he read the book. I remember he phoned me on a Sunday morning at 7 in the morning, woke me up. I said, Jesus, George, times. He said, you kept me up all night with that book. I loved it. So I'm going to call you now. And he wanted Elliot Gould to play the rabbi. And Elliot Gould phoned me at 7 in the morning. And I thought, what is with these people? I said, are you in New York? Said, no, I'm here. George Barry said I should phone you. And we never got it made. It'll get made yet. There's always, the wonderful thing with these books is that generations later, they're just different casts that you can have in them. So far, only one of my 14 books has been filmed. That was my second novel called The Next to Last Train Ride. And it was made, it's the last American movie that Richard Lester directed. It was called Finders Keepers. And Michael O'Keefe and Beverly D'Angelo starred in it. And I think it's David Wayne's last performance. He's brilliant in it.
Boy, it sounds like. Have you interviewed any rabbis? Because I suspect if you get close to a rabbi and you interview them, they probably tell you that when they're a rabbi, they channel their inner rabbi.
Well, all the rabbis in the book, other than the fake version of me, were based on rabbis in Toronto growing up. I can say that now because those guys are dead and they can't sue me. But there was one rabbi in particular who I had a relationship with because his daughter was in school with me, and he was just the con man of life. He didn't even go to a yeshiva. I think he was like a mail order rabbi or something.
But he played the role well.
Oh my goodness, yes, he was. I'd been a chaplain in World War II, and then I discovered, for a week, and then he came home.
Back to you. So you never really had, from your perspective, a choice. Your career was acting, writing, a novelist, directing, and so forth, right? That's it.
Yeah, they were all intertwined. Um, the how I got into writing was, I was 16 years old. I'd just done a season in the theater, and there weren't many starring roles for 16-year-olds. And a man named Eli Rill, who taught at the Actors Studio, said, "You should read Catcher in the Rye." And I was sort of, everyone read Catcher in the Rye, and I was like, well, I'm not going to read it. He said, no, read it. And he said, you could turn that into a play for yourself. I said, well, how would I do that? He said, just go, you'll see. There are these passages of dialogue, and you'll make it work. And I did. And I adapted, directed, and played Holden Caulfield in this one night only production of Catcher in the Rye, because I got a letter from the publishers. I purposely wrote the letter knowing they couldn't answer in time. And the day after the production, I got a letter from the publisher saying, under no circumstances are you to proceed with this. But I also had the temerity to invite this woman who reviewed amateur productions around Toronto. She wrote for the Toronto Telegram, and she came and she wrote this wonderful review of the production.
Well, that of my generation, which approximates yours, Catcher in the Rye was every kid's pocket companion. We all thought ourselves as Holden Caulfield. One of my favorite short stories that Salinger wrote, and there's these one-liners that come out of it that were wonderful. If you recall, I think the short story was A Perfect Day for Banana Fish. And it depicts the character, it may have been Seymour, who was apparently he was a veteran of the war, and he's walking down a path on a hill in the middle of a lightning storm. And he's talking about the prospect that lightning might have struck him as he's walking down the hill. And here's a guy who's been a veteran of the war. And as he's walking down the hill, he remarks to the reader, if your number's up, your number's up, anticipating that he might or might not be struck by lightning.
I've lost the sound, Tom.
Okay.
Well, I am recording all of my books that Amazon is republishing for Audible. And so I get up every day having to do these recordings. I'm also I'm doing the pilot for a web series called Nom de Plume, and so I'm getting ready to shoot that. And then there's another short film I'm doing with Patty McCormick, who's a longtime friend, who's been in most of my films, and my wife, who I drafted into acting about 3 years ago when an actress didn't turn up, and I said, Ulrika, you got to play this. She said, I said, you've got to do it. And she was marvelous. And she ended up starring in the last feature of mine and won the Best Actress Award at the Vegas Film Awards last year. So she said, could you write something for me to do with Patty? I said, of course. And so I'm energized by life. I'm energized by getting up every morning and saying, hey, I'm still above ground.
That's exciting, to be above ground and to have a purpose and to have a wife that is so devoted. For the sake of our audience, what I have been impressed with is your tale of recreation and transformation. That it sounds as if you have negotiated the challenges of life by doing the best you can to channel your potential, your heroic self to achieve what you wanted to achieve. Do you actually consciously go through that process? Is your self-talk that of, okay, I've done stuff like this before, I can meet the challenge, I can do stuff like this again in the future?
I think I'm a commando. I just jump out of the plane,
Okay.
or I pick up the gun. I don't go through. I mean, I try. It's interesting. In 1980, I had not been on stage for 10 years. And um, I think the previous year I had seen Death Trap when it came to Los Angeles with Brian Bedford. And I thought, God, I'd love to play this part. And a year later, I ended up getting the part in London, Ontario, at this wonderful old Edwardian theater called the Grand Theater. And I almost had a nervous breakdown because I just was. And I remember the director of the artistic director who was also directing the play. He said, "Do you think you can do this?" I said, "Why not?" He said, "Because you haven't been on stage for 10 years." And I thought, what is that? And then I found out what you can't, use it or lose it. And so I've tried to make a point of going back on stage um, with greater frequency. And I was on stage in it's 19, 2 years ago in a play of mine called King Solomon's Treasure, which we ended up filming. And then that film was shown at the Studio City Film Festival, and I won the Best Actor Award for it. And there is that process, that comes back to you. There's a point in rehearsal where you go, God, this thing is awful. It's because you've been doing it and doing it, and you haven't had the audience experience. And then there's that stage fright just before you go out there, but they're familiar because it's part of certainly my process, and I read about people like Olivier at one point in his life. The stage fright was so terrible he thought he could never go on stage again. It's I remember I was friends with Hume Cronin, and he was going to do a play, and he talked to me about stage fright. And I had just done a play of mine at the Edinburgh Fringe, and I remember that was my first time on stage since doing Death Trap, and it was almost 10 years. And I remember I was in the middle of a performance, and this Stephen King like creature appeared behind my leading lady. And I thought, and I'm still saying my dialogue, but my brain is seeing this thing. And I thought, I can't have this bothering me. And I said, fuck off. And it vanished. Now I said, fuck off while I'm still doing my own lines. So anyhow, I told Hume the story, and we were having lunch. He said, so you want me to say fuck off to some creature? I said, it worked for me, Hume. I'm sorry, But God bless him, and he kept going at it. But the play that I did, that I won the award for, was a 2-character play, but it had been a 1-character play before that. And I had sent the play to Hume when he was in his 80s. I have his letter framed on the wall of my office here. And he said, Charles, I can't. I'm going to be 82, this summer, and I can't learn all these words. And I thought, oh my God, does that happen? So some actors, Chris Plummer, God bless him, he was going, he dropped dead at 91 or something, but I remember seeing him in his late 80s on stage here in Los Angeles. He was still going strong.
It's just extraordinary. I had, some of the vignettes I recall was the thing that he had done with Diane Ladd and John Cusack, Must Love Dogs.
Yes, yes.
And if you recall, he plays the part of Diane Ladd's father, who is trying to hook up with someone. And he's meeting this woman that he was hoping to meet. And of course, he's holding a book with a rose in it. And it turns out that he's meeting his own daughter.
Yes, yeah, it was lovely.
Yeah.
He had a love-hate relationship with movies for many years. And I think was doing The Man Who Would Be King when he played Rudyard Kipling. And something changed, something shifted. and suddenly he embraced the camera. And from that point on, he was a wonderful movie actor. His earlier stuff, he never really made a dent. And he foolishly, badmouth Sound of Music. I think what an embarrassment it had been for him. And I thought, what are you, nuts? It's the most successful movie ever made. Um, he would call it Sound of Mucus, and he just.
Well, I share with him his taste. It is not a musical that I'm drawn to.
No, but I mean, years later, he would always rave about it. What a wonderful time he had, and he and Julie Andrews reunited. They did on Golden Pond, which wasn't very good with them. But he was, and his Lear. I mean, I saw that in New York, and he was amazing. His Cyrano, all the classical work he did.
Well, as I shared with you off camera, my first exposure to him when I was but a lad, and he wasn't much older, was at Stratford, Ontario, when he played Hamlet. And he took a play which, as a kid, I read and reread and thought, okay, everybody dies in the end. And he did a beautiful job. It was transformative. He did something for the role that I've never seen anybody do, other than perhaps Olivier in the film. And the accident of his involvement in his, I think it may have second or third last film, All the Money in the World, where he replaced Kevin.
Oh, yes, where he had to go replace Kevin Spacey. Yeah.
Yes, was incredible. I mean, he did beautifully in that. And then I think his last major film was Knives Out. With what a cast was that?
Yes, and there now he was 90.
Right, and he did it beautifully. So for you, how much did your childhood disappointments, childhood insecurities inform what became of you as an actor? That may be a stretch.
I wasn't an athlete. So acting really was my claim to fame. I lived to act because I was able to emerge from the shadow of two older brothers who were these academic genii, and I wasn't a very good student either. But acting, damn, I was good, and I loved doing it. And I used to try and drag in my friends. I mean, the cast of Catcher in the Rye were all my friends who had, didn't really have stage experience. But and this is something. Even before I did that radio show, when I was 7 years old, Tom, I had my tonsils out. Something apparently that nobody does anymore. My wife is considerably younger than me. She never had her tonsils out. I don't know anyone born after 1960 who's ever had their tonsils out, but it was quite a racket in the 50s. Did you have your tonsils out?
Of course, because my father was a physician and I grew up in the era. It was just the thing to do, right? No, I grew up in the era, and I think people need to appreciate this. The reason why kids of my generation had their tonsils out is that we weren't terribly successful treating streptococcal infections with antibiotics. And failing to treat recurrent strep left you a legacy of potential problems such as glomerulonephritis, kidney disease, or rheumatic heart disease. So it was almost like prophylactic surgery to do your tonsils and adenoids.
Huh. You're the first person to explain it to me. Thank you. I had my tonsils out and I was recuperating, and the only good part of it was you could only eat chocolate ice cream. Nothing else would go down that poor inflamed throat. And my cousin Cookie gave me this golden book. It was like a coffee table sized book of Walt Disney's Peter Pan, which had just come out as an animated feature. And I leafed through this thing, and this is the part I still don't understand. I had never been to a theater in my life. Well, I was 7. Where would I have seen anything? But somehow I got the notion to do my own version of Peter Pan. And I did it in our backyard. And I got all the neighborhood kids to be in it. The problem with that was we had no audience because all the kids were in the garden playing the part. And all these years later, I'm still doing that. I'm getting all my friends together who fortunately are actors and successful actors to be in these films that I make. I mean, my first feature film here, I had Dabney Coleman, Bryan Cranston, Paula Prentice, um, Ed Asner. You know, they all turned up and worked for me, and I've been able to do that since. People believe in my work, they enjoy working with me, and it's just the legacy of that production in the backyard of Peter Pan.
So it's clear if you look at your website that you hang with the big dogs. I notice on your website you've got two Bryans, Cox and Cranston, Ron Perlman, and others. Uh, and so is there a kind of an entourage of Hollywood character actors that you hang with?
You know, Brian Cox I've known for 50 years. When I first moved to London, and I ended up at the end of the first year sharing a flat with two guys who had been at the Birmingham Rep, and that group included Michael Gambon and Cox, far from who they are now. Um, and then my life in the theater is a tapestry, you know, and these are just threads. And the wonderful thing I discovered about the theater was that people aren't snobbish. You know, they love you to come backstage. If somebody doesn't come backstage after performance, they go, "What's wrong? Nobody liked it." And so I remember when I went to London to direct a musical back in 1971, and I'd see a play, and I go back to congratulate the actors. I told them I'm directing a musical, and they were all wonderful, always happy to meet you. It's this fraternity of the theater.
Charles, how many different memoirs have you written, or are you in the process of writing one now?
Cranston keeps saying to me, "When are you going to write your book?" I know that I've had this podcast before called Paid to Dream, and I'm going to start that one up again. But my title I wanted to use was "Who the Hell is Charles Dennis?" Because I remember interviewing Jason Robards backstage for the newspaper, and he was married to Bacall at the time, and she was on Broadway in Cactus Flower, and he was on Broadway in The Devils, and she would call him every night after the show, and he was on there going, "Yeah, I'm sitting here with Charles Dennis," and from the other end I could hear through the phone, "Who the hell is Charles Dennis?" And I thought, it's a great title.
That's great.
So soon I am going to finally start putting all this stuff down. Some of it, like Body in the Window Seat, has a lot of stuff about me in it because of my working with these people. But yeah, I guess I better do it soon.
My first novel is going to begin with a memory of the protagonist who recalls vividly a rabbi and another character standing over him, cutting off the end of his penis. And he talks about what it's like to begin life with surgically induced inadequacy. Well, I would be delighted if she would. I would say, in terms of looking at your own life, if you reflect on it, you do represent for me someone who's been most successful in challenging a variety of barriers, including one's own barriers in terms of stage fright. Can I do this? Can I overcome this? But the process of growing involves channeling one's heroic potential. And you have been successful in doing that in multiple times in your life. And I would be delighted to talk to you about other vignettes that you're willing to share with our audience. Okay, well, you have demonstrated an extraordinary adaptive quality, which also attests to your relative youth. Uh, so Keep going, buddy. You inspire me, and the next time I need a rabbi, I know who to turn to. Okay. So all of you out there, I encourage you to explore the works of Charles Dennis. I think that's wonderful. I will check out your bibliography when I have the spare moment. You have inspired me, and I'm sure I hope you've inspired our audiences. Also, if the audience would like to support our podcast, consider purchasing the book Dragon Slaying. Charles, I encourage you to read it, about overcoming trauma in your life and how to challenge and transform yourself into your own hero. Until next time, for all of you, be well, be conscious, and be forward looking. Charles, I look forward to further dialogue. Bye-bye.